safe in a shipwreck. Paul traveled to different cities telling people the good news about Jesus, and many became believers. In many places, Paul began new churches for these new believers. He wrote letters encouraging them to learn more about Jesus and to become more like him. But the leaders in the temple didn't like that Paul was preaching about Jesus. They wanted him to stop. They called him a troublemaker and worked to make his life very hard. During his life, Paul had been in prison many times and had been whipped and beaten. There were times that he had gone without food or water. He had faced danger almost everywhere he went, but Paul would not stop. He continued teaching the people and telling the good news that Jesus is the Christ. Acts 5:42. The temple leaders finally succeeded in having Paul arrested. Now the government rulers would decide what to do with him. Paul talked to several rulers and a king. None of them thought that Paul had done anything wrong, but Paul's enemies wanted him punished. After being in prison for 2 years, the king finally agreed to send Paul to see Caesar, the emperor of Rome. Paul was soon on a ship with his Roman guard, Julius, who would make sure that he got to Rome safely. Some of the believers gathered to say goodbye to their friend Paul. Some of them may have cried because they were afraid he would not return. As the ship sailed away, Paul may have felt very sad too. As the shore faded away into the distance, he saw for the last time the people and the places that he loved so much. After sailing for 2 days, Paul and Julius got off their boat and onto a much bigger ship, filled with bags and dried grain and 276 passengers. This ship would take them all the way to Rome. Soon after leaving the port, the wind began to blow. Winter was getting closer. It wasn't a good time for ships to sail on the seas. The wind began to blow harder. The waves grew bigger. For many days, the ship was tossed from side to side. The ship creaked and it groaned like it was going to break into pieces. The sailors did everything they could to try to save the ship. They threw heavy bags of grain into the deep, dark water. They passed ropes under the ship and tied them tight so the ship would hold together. They were desperate and they were afraid. "We're all going to drown," they cried. And they huddled together in fear on that ship. Paul had encouraging news for everyone on the ship. He said, "Don't be afraid. Last night, an angel told me nobody will die. Our ship will be destroyed, but everyone will live." Around midnight, on the 14th night, the captain discovered that they were near an island. This was good news. The soldiers threw the anchors into the water to stop the ship. As it got closer to the morning, Paul realized that no one had eaten much food in the past 14 days. Everyone was tired and worn out. Paul encouraged them, "We need to eat to survive. God has promised us that no one will die." He took some bread and thanked God for the food, broke off a piece and ate it. Paul helped the people see that God was in charge and that they began to eat some bread too. In the morning, everyone could see a sandy shore in the distance. The sailors cut the anchors loose and the ship headed toward the island. When it seemed like the ship was going to make it safely to the beach, it hit a pile of sand that had built up underneath the water along the shore. The ship was stuck. Giant waves pounded against the back of the ship, and it began to break apart. Some were able to swim toward the shore, while others held on to broken parts of the ship and struggled to the shore. But no one died, just like God had promised. Some of the islanders who lived there came to make sure that everyone was all right. They built a fire to help the people get warm and dry. While others were warming themselves by the fire, Paul searched for more wood to help keep the fire burning. As he added a handful of sticks to the fire, a snake wiggled away from the heat, bit Paul on the hand, and hung on with its fangs. The islanders were terrified. They were sure the snake's powerful poison would start to work quickly. There was nothing they could do to help Paul, but Paul just shook the snake off and went back to gathering wood for the fire and making sure that everyone was safe. Nothing at all happened to him. The islanders were amazed. Publius, the man who was in charge of the island, lived nearby, and he heard what had happened, and he invited Paul to stay with him at his house. When Paul got there, he learned that Publius' father was very sick, and Paul wanted to help the old sick man, so he prayed and he asked God to make him well again. Immediately he was healed. Soon many others on the island heard about the God who had the power to save people from a storm and heal sick people. Sick people from all over came to Paul to be healed. Many also came to hear more about this powerful God. Paul spent 3 months on the island, caring for people and healing them with God's power, praying for them and teaching them about God's Son. Paul's enemies thought that by arresting him, they would stop his preaching. But nothing stopped Paul. None of his hard times, not prison, not a shipwreck, not a snake bite. He was happy to help other people learn about God and God's love. Paul learned how to love others just like God loved him. He knew that this was important for believers to know. So he wrote to them, mostly what God does is love you. Keep company with him and learn a life of love. Love like that. Ephesians 1:5. God sends us on a mission just like he sent Paul. We show and tell others and the good news about Jesus when we love and care for others. How can you love and care for others like God loves you? What can you do to care for others? How can you tell them God loves you? The end.